Statements are either true or they are false. Or are they? The truth is that so many of the most famous and cherished stories and characters of the past are neither mythical nor historical. They are legendary. A legend sits at the blurry boundaries between mythology and history, between fact and fiction. Oftentimes they include real-world people and real-world events that have become exaggerated, added to, subtracted from, and over the time morphed into new stories that combine both fact and fiction, woven into a narrative that may be more fantastical than reality, but more down to earth than mythology. Or perhaps a story that, through its plausibility, may mislead an audience into conflating that story with the truth, in a way that mythology could not mislead. Nonetheless, a legend status, blurring the lines between fact and fiction, has provided some of the most influential and fascinating stories humanity has told. So let's go over some of the most influential legendary figures. First on the list is from Egypt, and that is King Scorpion. This man would unify Upper and Lower Egypt into what is arguably the first true nation. What makes this weird is that the historical record and narratives are so plentiful, yet so sparse depending on how you look at it, to the point that there may have been 2 or maybe even 3 people whose stories have merged into that of King Scorpion. The man who is arguably the first great historical leader in human history has a record so mysterious and so blurred by the sands of time that we really don't know about who he actually was. Menes was one version of the figure. This guy predates the pyramids of Egypt, that's how old he is. He lived around 3200 to 3000 BC. He is most famous for uniting Upper and Lower Egypt into one unified first dynasty, laying the foundations of one of the most influential and long-lasting civilizations in history. With that being said, we really don't know that much about him. There are 2 other major figures from very early ancient Egyptian history that kind of mesh with his. Those are those of Narmer and Scorpion II. Narmer was probably the same person as Menes, but going that far back in history, it's really hard to tell how his stories may have been true or false, or most likely exaggerated. Overall, the legends of Narmer and Menes are rather similar when it comes to unifying Upper and Lower Egypt. However, we don't have too many records of Menes engaging in conquest in Levant and what is now Israel and the Palestinian territories, whereas we do for Narmer. So were they the same person? Well, we really don't know. On top of that, there's also a figure with a way cooler name that I named before, the aforementioned Scorpion King, or King Scorpion. You may have heard of the mediocre movie starring The Rock that was named after this figure. But then again, all 3 of these characters just kind of blurred into one. Also, fun fact, Menes probably was killed by a hippo. Moving on from Egypt and bad CGI, or actually, more accurately, speaking of Egypt, let's talk about another figure that you almost certainly have heard of. His name is Moses. This video is not meant to debate religious matters. Moses is the founder of Judaism, the first of the Abrahamic religions, as Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, all according to their own faiths, are the descendants of Abraham. Now, far from a historical perspective, many of the events laid out in the book of Exodus in the Bible probably are not true. There is very little evidence the Jews lived in Egypt during the time of the pyramids, and a lot of evidence against it. The book of Exodus contains numerous anachronisms, such as the name of cities that did not exist at the time of the pyramids, and the domestication of camels that wasn't actually implemented during that time either. According to the archaeological evidence, the kingdoms of Judea and Israel emerged after the Bronze Age collapse, well after the iconic era of ancient Egyptian New Kingdom. However, there is some evidence of migration from Egypt to Canaan and vice versa. Perhaps a real person had led a group of migrants into what is now known as the Holy Land. This story, along with the stories of others, probably was combined and morphed into what we now know as the story of Exodus, with the Israelites escaping from Egypt and getting hold of the 10 Commandments, while spending 40 years wandering around the desert as a result of their inobedience to God. Now, you can debate the historicity of this tale, but in my opinion, the ending of Exodus is totally epic. Moses finally takes his people to the promised land and dies looking upon the land atop a mountain, knowing that he will never live there, never experience it himself, but he has fulfilled his purpose. Let's move on to King David. After all, we were talking about the Bible. When the Israelites returned to the Promised Land, they sought a king to rule them rather than a bunch of priests. According to the Bible, King Saul was the first king and united Israel. But it would be King David who would rise up after he defeated the Philistine Goliath. Despite David's personal flaws, he is considered to be the most famous figure of the ancient Israelite state. History, on the other hand, shows that there were more likely two separate states, Israel and Judea, which were never unified. However, there is still more research that needs to be done. Nonetheless, David still probably existed in real life, as we've seen a tablet that mentions the House of David. Regardless of the historicity, his symbol, the Star of David, has become the symbol of Judaism and the Jewish people and the state of Israel. We even have a tablet proving that there was a House of David, by the way. Speaking of that house, let's go on to his son, Solomon, who, according to the story, took control of the crown after the death of his father. He is said to have ruled over Israel and Judea at the peak of his wealth and power, as Solomon was renowned for his wisdom. Under his rule, the temple was said to have been built, which, while being in the service of God, was also part of his track record of extravagance. Solomon was famed for his number of wives, concubines, and riches. We don't know for sure if Solomon existed. If he did exist, he probably was a king of Judea at some point, but not Israel. Since Judea was much poorer than ancient Israel, it is likely that his kingdom was not as wealthy as scripture states. It is also likely that the Judeans adopted monotheism after the destruction of the Second Temple, well after the life of Solomon. However, that does not mean that these stories don't have value. The tales of Solomon and his wisdom have captivated people from all over the world, far and wide. And that leads us to the next figure on the list, someone who Solomon knew personally to a great degree, Queen Sheba. If you're familiar with King Solomon, you've probably also heard of Queen Sheba. According to the story, she visits King Solomon hearing tales of his wealth and wisdom. If she did exist, she was most likely from southern Arabia in what is now Yemen. Just across the Red Sea from Yemen is Ethiopia and Eritrea. Ethiopia has one of the most underrated histories in the world, and has a population of not only Christians and Muslims, but also Jews. The story implies some sort of love affair between Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, or Queen Sheba, I should say. In the Ethiopian national epic, the Kebra Agsat, which I'm mispronouncing, also known as the Glory of Kings, the child of Solomon and Queen Sheba would be Menelik I, setting up the foundations of what would later be the Christian Ethiopian dynasty, with deep legendary ties to Israel and Mount Zion. If you're wondering why Bob Marley mentioned Zion so many times in his songs, it's because according to his religion of Rastafarianism, the last emperor of Ethiopia was believed to be the second coming of Christ. After all, Jesus was a descendant of King Solomon according to the Bible, and likewise so was the last emperor of Ethiopia, who apparently was a descendant of Menelik I, and therefore a descendant of King Solomon. Next on the list is Homer. This is a meta example. Homer is credited as being the writer of the Iliad, the story of the Trojan War, as well as the Odyssey, the story of Odysseus, a hero of the Trojan War's voyage back home to Greece. The issue is that we aren't really sure if Homer truly existed, at least not in the way that is typically described. Given the different writing styles of the Iliad and the Odyssey, it is likely that they were written by two different poets. It could be the case that Homer was not a person, but rather an amalgamation of several authors under one name. These authors probably were borrowing heavily from several oral traditions before pen was put to paper. Regardless of this, Homer's work provided the Greeks with a variety of unified narratives around their pre-Dark Age past, a set of stories that would begin the Western canon. And speaking of the Western canon, we got to go to another incredibly influential nation on the European continent, the UK. Namely, the island of Britain, namely England. Before it was even called England, King Arthur. Britain's recorded history is much younger than that of Greece. There were barely any written records until the conquest by the Romans, as the native Celtic peoples did not have a writing system. The Romans themselves didn't really care that much about Roman Britain. It was the most remote, poorest shithole in the empire, and as a result, they by and large didn't leave much of a genetic impact on the island either. Maybe they didn't think the gingers were hot. However, they did spread writing. They also set up the foundations of Londinium, which would eventually become London and would spread Christianity. And they would also delight in killing a lot of Celts. This created a Romano-Celtic culture that would face serious challenges due to the widespread barbarian invasions, namely from Germanic groups. The Romans would eventually pull out of the western half of the empire after Rome was sacked, and many Germanic groups would come in, namely the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes. If you've ever heard of the term Anglo-Saxon, this is where it comes from. It doesn't really refer to generic white people, but rather Dark Age people groups who immigrated or invaded what is now England that would later inspire this story. While most of the elements of the story of King Arthur are fictional, it is likely that a real-life warlord or king of Romano-Celtic cultural origin fought against the Germanic invasions. It's quite amusing that this has become so inspirational for British people and many people around the world, given the fact that in many ways, King Arthur's figure was actually fighting against the Germanic barbarians who would lay the foundations of the modern British state. And speaking of Germanic people, let's talk about one prominent Germanic figure, Ragnar Lothbrok. Icons of Norse mythology have become household names: Thor, Odin, and Loki, mainly due to the Marvel movies. Ragnar was, according to legend, a Viking raider raiding the coast of Britain, as well as supposedly being the leader of the Siege of Paris. This is followed by tales of his sons, such as Ivar the Boneless, Ubbe, and others. We really don't know if Ragnar existed, but we do know that his sons existed, so I would probably come to the conclusion that he probably existed in some way, shape, or form, but has been exaggerated. Let's move on eastward to Dracula. Now, obviously, vampires don't exist as far as I know, but the character Bram Stoker wrote about in his 1897 novel Dracula is clearly heavily inspired by the folklore that was common in the region of Transylvania in modern-day Romania. It is likely that these stories were inspired by Vlad the Impaler, a king who was rather fond of taking up Turks and impaling them while he sat down for dinner. Scholars debate to this day about just how strong of an inspiration Vlad the Impaler was for Dracula. However, it has provided a lot of inspiration for kids to dress up as some generic vampire for Halloween. So let's move on to something less disturbing. How about a guy who isn't fond of impaling people while he eats dinner? Santa Claus. More accurately, Father Christmas. We all know Santa Claus, and while I'm sorry to tell you that Santa does indeed not exist, Santa is inspired by a number of characters, real and fictional. Saint Nicholas was a man of Greek ethnicity living in now what is Turkey during the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire, famed for saving little girls from being trafficked and giving lots of coins and gifts to kids. He eventually became the patron saint of children. His tales of good deeds have become interwoven with those of other figures, real and mythological. Some of the mythological ones are Odin, the Viking god. This would morph into Sinterklaas in the Netherlands and Father Christmas in Britain. Eventually, the Dutch would found the city of New York City, which was then called New Amsterdam. The British would eventually take that up, and these Dutch and British stories would morph into something quite uniquely American. His name is, you guessed it, Santa Claus. Speaking of the United States, let's move on to some more modern folk heroes. Joaquim Murrieta. Sorry, my Spanish pronunciation is utterly terrible. When Spanish people pronounce something in English, it sounds sexy. When English speakers try to pronounce something in Spanish, it just sounds really lame. This man was a desperado, roaming California during the 1800s. Keep in mind that this was during the aftermath of the Mexican-American War. There were a lot of Anglo settlers that were settling down in what is now California, which was once part of the Empire of Spain and Mexico. After the hanging of his brother and death of his wife, he sought vengeance against the Anglos that had brutalized his family. While the accuracy of these accounts is debatable, his story had inspired the legend of Zorro. To be clear, the legend of Zorro isn't actually a legend, but a pop culture fictional character based off of the actual legendary figure. In fact, there are plenty of legendary figures that come from North America's colonial period, showing us that legends aren't simply a product of the ancient world. One that you may have heard of if you are American or Canadian is Paul Bunyan, the famous folk hero of the frontier woodlands. Paul was supposedly a giant lumberjack from either the US or Canada, depending on the version of the tale. while the story of a giant using his axe to create the Grand Canyon and the tears of his pet cow being the source of the Mississippi River are, let's just say, hard to believe, the origin of Paul Bunyan's story probably resides in that of a real-life lumberjack or lumberjacks whose hard work and can-do spirit pioneered the frontier of the North American continent. While typically depicted as a white man, it is possible that this story was initially based upon tales by First Nations and Native American peoples of the Great Lakes region, which eventually was adopted by French-Canadian folktales and then by Anglo folktales later on to create a unique character. The next person on the list is also from North America, John Henry. The last person on this list, in fact. John Henry is said to have been a former slave who sought work building on railroad tracks. Despite the bigotry he faced as a black man, he still won the respect of his fellow workers through his immense strength, as well as his determination. According to the story, he worked himself to death, honorably and stoically, sacrificing his life for the coming abundance of industrialization. Industrialization not only led to the decline of a lot of typical farm work, but it also led to the decline of slavery, which was particularly telling for John Henry, a freedman. His death not only is a metaphor for the self-determination of the freed slave and the replacement of human muscle power with that of machines, but also a symbolization of the emancipation of African Americans. It is likely that the real man probably died from a lung disease rather than dying from exhaustion working on the railroad, but his death symbolizes the self-sacrifice of building a modern nation state. And there you have it. There are countless others I didn't name, but if you have some legendary figures that you'd like to add to the list, please feel free to drop them in the comments, especially if you are from one of the countries that I did not mention. Thanks for watching.